Etta Marsh was 19 years old when her uncle counted $37 onto his desk and called it a settlement. She had $1 of her own sewn into the lining of her boot, and in her coat pocket she carried a brass sighting compass, her grandfather's, the hinge worn smooth from 30 years under his thumb. The only other thing she owned in the world was a deed to a dead town, folded into a drawer for 11 years because nobody thought it worth the postage to mail back. Not one person in that office knew what was still sitting inside it, waiting on her. Before this story is over, you'll know why an entire town went quiet. And why a girl who left home with $37 ended up richer than every man who laughed her out the door on her way to find out. If you're watching tonight, tell me where you're tuning in from. This one takes a while to tell, right, so settle in. Etta's parents had died of influenza when she was 4, and after that she'd been raised on her grandfather Silas Marsh's survey claim at the edge of the basin. A low stone house with a chain and transit hung by the door the way other houses hung a crucifix. Silas didn't speak much and he didn't touch much either, not in the way some grandfathers did, ruffling hair or pulling a girl onto a knee at supper. His love came out sideways, folded into the trade. He taught her to true a level by feel before she ever learned to read the bubble. He taught her to hold a chain steady across broken ground without letting the sag creep into the measurement. He taught her that rock told the truth if a person was patient enough to ask it properly, and that water in dry country always left a signature, in the color of the brush. In the lean of a cottonwood, in the smell of a wash an hour before you ever reached it. Supper in that house was quiet. Walton, Silas's son and Etta's uncle, ate fast and left the table early most nights, already thinking ahead to the next survey contract, and nobody thought much of it. Since that was simply the shape the house took. Affection in the Marsh family wasn't a thing spoken aloud. It was a coat mended without being asked, a lamp left burning until a person got home, a plate kept warm past its hour. Etta learned early that this was what love looked like in her family, and she didn't grieve the absence of the other kind, because she had never really known there was another kind to miss. It was Silas who saw her clearly, the way nobody else in that house seemed to. On slow evenings he'd take her out past the corral with the transit and a notebook and let her call the readings herself, correcting her only when the correction genuinely mattered. Never for the small errors that time alone would teach her to fix. "You've got a good eye," he told her once, planing a fence rail with his back to her so the words came out easier than they would have face to face. "Better than most men I've paid a wage to stand where you're standing." It was the closest thing to praise the man ever gave outright. And she carried it the way other girls her age carried a keepsake locket. He told her stories too, in his flat, unhurried way, about towns the basin had swallowed whole over the years. One of them was Solace, a mining camp 2 days' ride into the dry country, emptied out sometime in 1955 when the main shaft flooded in the same season the vein feeding it pinched off to nothing. Whole families had walked away from houses mid-supper, he said once, plates still on the table. Though whether that particular detail was true or only the kind of thing old surveyors like to say about a ghost town, Etta never found out and never much cared to check. What she remembered clearest wasn't the rumor but the way his voice changed slightly when he told it, quieter, almost respectful. The way a man talks about a thing he's seen up close and never quite explained to his own satisfaction. He had held a small parcel there since before the flood, a nothing claim nobody had bothered contesting in all the years since. The kind of paper kept only because throwing it away takes more effort than filing it in a drawer. She remembered one lesson clearer than most, from the summer she turned 15. They'd walked out to a dry wash after a week without rain, and Silas had stopped her before she could step down into it. "Tell me what you see before you tell me what you know," he said, and waited while she looked, at the cottonwoods leaning subtly toward the wash's center. At a band of salt cedar thicker on one bank than the other, at the pale crust on the sand that cracked differently near a low seam of gravel. She named each thing slowly, unsure, and he let her keep going without correcting her until she'd worked her own way to the answer: water, not far down, and closer to the north bank than the south. He didn't tell her she was right. He only handed her the shovel. When she struck damp sand at 2 feet, he nodded once, the way he nodded at a chain reading that matched his own figures, and that nod meant more to her than a week of anyone else's praise. It was on the walk home from that same wash, boots wet to the ankle, that he'd first told her about Solace, a town, he said, that the ground itself had finally taken back. The way it eventually took back anything men forgot to keep asking questions of. Walton wasn't cold to her in those years, only distant in the particular way of a man raised by the same undemonstrative father and taught no other way to love a child. He kept her fed, kept her housed, paid for her schooling in town until she'd had as much of it as the county offered. And considered the accounts between them settled fair on every count that mattered to him. Silas Marsh died in his sleep the winter Etta turned 18, 11 months before this story properly starts. He left her his compass and nothing else that was truly his to give, since the claim, the business, and the house all passed, by right and by law, to his son. In the drawer of his desk, alongside a pair of eyeglasses and a fistful of surveying pencils worn down to stubs, Walton found the old deed to Solace and set it aside without much thought at all. The way a man sets aside a coat that no longer fits anyone left in the family. The dispossession came on a gray morning in early spring, in the same office where Silas had once let her call out chain lengths from memory while he checked her figures against his own. Walton sat behind the roll-top desk with a ledger open in front of him and counted the money out in coin and small bills, laying each piece flat against the blotter the way he'd set a survey stake. Precise and without flourish. $37. It was, he explained, her fair share of the household goods that had been sold off since his father's passing, the good stove, the spare harness. A set of chairs nobody in the family needed twice over. He was not cruel about it. He never once raised his voice, never once looked away from her while he said it. It was, in his mind, simple arithmetic, a settlement and not a punishment, and he seemed to believe that saying it plainly, without softening it, was itself a kind of respect he owed her. Alongside the coins he slid across a folded, brittle paper, the ink on its face gone the color of weak tea. This came up in the same drawer, he said. Deed to a claim your grandfather held out past the cutback, a dead town they used to call Solace. Nobody's had use for it in years, and the county won't take it back off my hands without a fee neither of us has cause to pay. It's rightfully yours by blood, since it's not the business's to keep. He said it the way a man returns an umbrella nobody had asked him to hold in the first place. Glad only to be rid of the obligation. You could sell it for whatever it'll fetch, once you're settled somewhere, he added, not unkindly, closing the ledger in front of him with the small final sound of a man who considered the matter closed along with it. Or you could go see it for yourself, I suppose, if you've a mind to. Either way, it's yours to decide now, not mine. Etta didn't argue and she didn't cry. An argument would have been as pointless as yelling at the wind, and crying wouldn't have put $1 more back on that blotter. She folded the deed once along its old crease, set it with the compass in the inside pocket of her coat, and thanked him plainly. Because thanking him cost her nothing and there was no sense spending anger on a man who genuinely hadn't meant any harm by it. That night she packed what she needed and nothing more. A skinning knife with a bone handle gone smooth from years of her grandfather's grip before it had ever been hers. A whetstone worn concave in the middle from long use. 20 feet of good hemp rope, coiled tight and tied off with a proper hitch. A tin cup, a tin plate, a folding fork with a bent tine she'd straightened herself with pliers the year before. 2 boxes of matches wrapped double in oilcloth against damp. Her grandfather's canvas field satchel, still faintly smelling of pipe tobacco and machine oil, into which she fit the compass, the deed, a spare shirt, a heel of bread. And as little else as she could manage without leaving herself short on the road. She left before first light, the way she'd learned to do most things in that house, quietly, without ceremony. Before anyone was awake to make the leaving strange or ask her to explain a decision that didn't need explaining. The road to Solace wasn't much of a road. Etta covered the first stretch by wagon with a freight hauler going as far as the cutback crossing and no farther, riding in the box among crated goods. watching the green thin out of the country mile by mile until even the fence posts stopped bothering to hold wire. The last day and a half she covered on foot, leading a borrowed mule with a stone bruise in its off-fore-hoof and no patience whatsoever for hurrying. The land flattened and dried as she went, brush thinning to scrub, scrub thinning to bare pan, the kind of ground men called useless because it wouldn't grow a thing worth selling. Though Silas had always said useless ground was mostly just ground nobody had bothered asking the right questions of yet. She used what he'd given her at every turn. When the mule balked at a dry wash rather than cross it, she read the color of the tamarisk crowding the banks and knew water wasn't far below the surface, if not sitting right on top of it after all. When the trail forked twice in one afternoon with no marker to say which branch was which, she sighted a distant mesa through the compass and matched the bearing against the crude survey sketch penciled onto the back of the deed. The way her grandfather had taught her to check ground truth against paper truth before trusting either one alone. On the first night out from the cutback the wind came up hard after dark and pulled half her small fire apart before she could shield it. And she spent an hour on her knees rebuilding the ring stone by stone, low and tight, the way Silas had taught her to build a fire for country that didn't want to let you have one. The mule went lamer before it went sounder, favoring the bruised hoof so badly by mid-morning of the second day that she walked the last 6 miles leading it rather than riding. Her own boots taking the punishment instead. She ate cold biscuit and a strip of dried meat and listened to the animal crop what little forage it could find between the rocks, and she wasn't lonely in the way she'd braced herself to be. His voice rode along the whole way, in the small corrections she made to her own pace and her own judgment without needing to be told twice. As present in the dark as if he'd been sitting a half-step behind her at the fire. She crested the last rise near dusk on the second day and looked down on Solace for the first time, and it was every bit as bad as its reputation had promised. A single dirt street ran between 2 rows of buildings gone gray and soft-edged with weather, roofs sagging where they hadn't already fallen clean through. Doors standing open on rooms drifted deep with wind-blown sand. A faded board that had once read Solace hung by a single nail over what must have been the old mercantile, swinging a little on the evening wind. Its paint scoured down to bare gray wood in patches the shape of years. Nothing moved in the whole street except the dust and that one loose board. It looked less like a town than like the memory of one, and for a long moment she simply stood on the rise with the mule's lead slack in her hand and let herself feel exactly how far away home was. Before she started down toward it anyway. She'd been in Solace less than an hour, still standing in the middle of the street with her satchel over one shoulder, when a rider came in from the east, a rancher named Hollis Bragg, who ran cattle across the old claim boundaries and had, by his own account, done so unbothered for the better part of a decade. He looked her over, looked at the town, and offered her $8 on the spot for the deed. So the county paperwork can finally die where it belongs and you can get on back to wherever it is you came from before the nights turn cold out here. He wasn't unkind about it, only certain. The particular certainty of a man who decided a thing was worthless long before anyone had bothered to check. No, thank you, Etta said, and that was the whole of her answer. Bragg pressed a little further, noting that $8 was $8 more than a dead town was worth to anyone with sense. And that the county assessor himself had called the place a loss twice over in the years since the shaft flooded. She didn't explain herself and she didn't raise her voice. She only said that she hadn't walked 2 days through open country to sell the first thing she got offered for it, and after a moment Bragg shrugged. Allowed that she'd likely come around once the first hard freeze found her sleeping under a roof with no shingles left on it, and rode on without any real malice behind the words at all. She watched him go until his dust settled back into the flat gray of the basin, and then she turned back to the empty street in front of her. Because there was nothing left to do about a man's opinion except get to work proving it wrong one repaired roof at a time. She chose the old land office to live in, since its roof had held better than most and its walls were adobe brick instead of the warped clapboard everything else in town was built from. The first days were nothing but labor, one task folding into the next before she'd finished feeling the ache of the last. She hauled out better than a decade of blown sand with a busted grain scoop she found half buried in the wreck of the livery, working until her palms blistered and then went hard past blistering. She scrubbed the one unbroken window with wet sand and a rag until light came through it clean for the first time in years. And stood there a moment just watching dust motes turn gold in the new brightness. She reset the door on its hinges using grease she rendered herself from a can of bacon fat, and when it swung true on the very first try, without catching on the jam the way it had for the first 4 attempts, she stood working it back and forth for a full minute, feeling a satisfaction wildly out of proportion to the task. And let herself have it anyway. A trap she rigged from scrap wire and a tin lid caught its first rat on the second night, and she counted that among her victories too. She patched the worst of the roof with shake split from a fallen fence rail, learning the knack of it by the third one after ruining the first 2. And by the end of the week the ceiling over her cot had stopped weeping dust every time the wind picked up outside. She dug a shallow pit for a cook fire and lined it with stone the way Silas had shown her on 100 other evenings that had nothing to do with any of this. And the first night she managed a fire that caught on 1 match instead of 6, she allowed herself something close to pride. She found the old town well choked with a decade of blown sand and fallen brush, and cleared it by the bucketful over 3 full days. Her hands raw and her shoulders aching in a way that felt less like injury than like proof of use. She walked the length of the street more than once with a critical eye, the way Silas used to walk a claim boundary before he'd commit a single stake to the ground. Cataloging which buildings still had honest bones under their neglect and which had gone past saving. Most nights she fell asleep before she meant to, sitting upright against the wall with a mending needle still in her hand, and woke stiff and cold before first light to start again. Nobody was there to see any of it. She did it well regardless, because doing a thing well without an audience was the only way her grandfather had ever taught her to do anything at all. It was patching a draft in the land office floor, nearly 2 weeks in, that led her to it. One board near the old stove sat a half-inch proud of its neighbors, and when she knelt to plane it flush she noticed the nails weren't original, square-cut and old like the rest of the floor, but driven in a slightly different pattern, the kind of mismatch only someone trained to notice patterns in surfaces would have caught at all. She worked the board loose with her grandfather's own pry bar, gentle, patient, the way he'd taught her to lift a stubborn survey stake without snapping the grain. Beneath it lay a shallow cavity, and inside that, disappointingly, only a scatter of empty glass specimen jars and a fine drift of dust. As though whatever had once filled the space had been picked clean by time and nothing else. She turned each jar over in her hands anyway, checking for a false bottom or a scratched mark. The way Silas had taught her never to trust an empty space until she confirmed with her own hands that it was truly empty and not simply hiding its contents better than she was looking. Every jar came back plain. She almost gave it up there and moved on to the next draft in the floor. But the cavity's back wall didn't sit quite flush against the foundation stone behind it. And something in that small mismatch nagged at her the way an untrue reading nags at a surveyor who knows the numbers are close but not close enough to trust. She worked a mortise chisel along the seam, slow, testing rather than forcing, exactly as Silas had taught her never to force a joint that hadn't yet told you where it wanted to give. The stone shifted a half-inch under steady pressure. Behind it sat a small iron box, banded and padlocked, and beside the box, wrapped in a scrap of oilcloth gone brittle as old paper, a folded letter and a small carved wooden bird no bigger than her thumb, its wings still showing the fine, careful strokes of a patient knife. She sat back on her heels in the dust and thought of her grandfather's voice as clear as if he'd been standing in the doorway behind her. The ground doesn't lie, Etta. It only waits for somebody patient enough to ask it right. She'd asked. And after 11 years of silence, it had finally answered. The lock gave to the same pry bar, in time, worked rather than wrenched. Inside the box she found silver dollars stacked in rolled cloth, more coin gathered in one place than she'd ever seen in her life. And beneath the coin a folded assay report and a hand-drawn claim map marking a vein that had, as far as she could tell from the notations, never once been worked. She set all of it carefully aside on the floorboards and unfolded the letter first, because the letter, she understood already, was the true reason any of the rest of it mattered. To whomever finds this, my name is Cornelius Abbott. I was the surveyor and assayer for the Solace mine from the year it opened until the year it flooded, and I am the last man who lived in this town. Though by the time you read this I expect I will be gone from it too, one way or another. If you have found this box, you have likely also found the claim map and the assay report folded beneath the coin. The vein they describe runs true. I surveyed it myself, twice over, to be certain, because I intended it to be the foundation of something lasting. The silver in the box is what I managed to save from my wages across 11 years, kept back a little at a time rather than spent, because I meant to build a house with it. Take all of it. Take the claim too, if it still holds any value by whatever year finds you reading this. I have no family left to leave it to, and I would rather it build something good for a stranger than sit here in the dark building nothing at all. My wife Margaret and I came to Solace the year the shaft opened, and our daughter Ruth was born here 2 winters after. I had drawn plans for a house on the rise above the wash, with a porch facing west so Margaret could sit out evenings and watch the light come down off the mesa. And I had been putting this silver toward the lumber and the glass for it, a little more set aside each season as the wage allowed. In the same winter the shaft flooded and the company pulled its equipment out for good. Scarlet fever came through the camp. It took Ruth first, and then it took Margaret 11 days after her, and by the time the last families packed their wagons and left this street for good, I had nothing left in this town worth following anyone home for, and nothing left outside it either. So I stayed on. I told myself for a good while that I was only finishing the survey. I expect now that I was really only finishing something else, something with no proper name to it. The bird wrapped alongside this letter I carved for Ruth the winter she was born, meaning to give it to her once she was old enough to hold something small without breaking it in her fist. I never got the chance to put it in her hands. I have kept it near me ever since, and I am glad, whoever you are, that it will not simply rot here unseen with the rest of what this town left behind. Perhaps you have a child of your own, or will have one someday. Give it to them, if that suits you, or keep it for yourself and let it mean whatever it needs to mean in your own life. Either seems better to me than the alternative of leaving it here in the dark. I don't know who will find this box, or when, or what kind of world you'll be standing in when you finally do. I only hope you use what's here to build something worth the building, since I never did get the chance to finish mine. I bear this town no grudge for what it took from me, and I bear whoever reads this letter none either. I only wish you well, and I wish you the house I never got to raise. Cornelius Abbott, assayer, Solace. She set the letter down and looked again at the claim map beneath it, and understood now what she was looking at. Cornelius Abbott's hand was as careful on paper as her grandfather's had ever been, every elevation noted. Every bearing double-checked and initialed in the margin the way a man initials work he intends to stand behind. The assay report beside it recorded or samples pulled from 3 separate points along the vein, each one better than the last, and dated across nearly 2 years of quiet, unpaid labor carried out long after the company itself had given up and gone home. He hadn't surveyed it for wages. He'd surveyed it, she understood now, because it was the only work left in the world that still felt like building towards something, even after there was no longer anyone waiting at the end of it. Etta sat with the letter a long time after she finished it, the light going from gold to gray through the one clean window while she read it a second time and then a third. When the weeping finally came, it wasn't for herself. She wept for a man who had spent 11 years of careful wages on a porch that faced west, for a wife who never got to sit on it, and for a small daughter who never once held the bird carved patiently for her own 2 hands. The silver in the box felt suddenly like the lesser half of what she'd found. The letter was the true inheritance, and the coin was only the means by which she might honor it properly. She thought of the porch he'd drawn plans for, facing west so a woman who died young could watch the light come down off the mesa. And of a stack of silver dollars set aside coin by coin across 11 patient years for a family that never got to spend a single one of them. She folded the letter along its brittle crease with the same care she'd once given her uncle's deed, wrapped the carved bird back in its oilcloth for the walk home, and made up her mind. Sitting there in the dust with the last light draining out of the room. That whatever she built on this ground from here forward would be built in a way Cornelius Abbott would have recognized as worth the long wait. She rode back to the nearest settlement 3 days later with a single silver dollar in her coat pocket and a plan taking shape behind her eyes the whole way there. At the livery she paid Gideon Pruitt, the blacksmith, that 1 coin to resho her mule properly, and when he bit it out of old habit and found it good, old, heavier than modern minting, and unmistakably real, he looked at her a good deal longer than he had the first time she'd walked through his door. She didn't explain where it had come from and he didn't ask outright. She only asked, plainly, whether he'd be willing to ride out to Solace and look at a wagon axle she couldn't true on her own. Gideon was a gruff man who didn't extend himself easily to strangers, and he tested her before he agreed to anything at all, handed her a hammer and a stubborn bent strap of iron and stood back. Arms crossed over his leather apron, watching while she worked it straight without ruining the temper of the metal, exactly the way her grandfather had once shown her. When she finished, she set the hammer down and waited without saying a word, and Gideon studied the strap a long moment before he grunted something that might, in a more talkative man, have been outright approval. Tuesday, he said, and that was the whole of the agreement. Odalise Finch, a widow who kept a boarding table near the livery, fed her a plate of beans and cornbread the very first afternoon Etta sat too long on the porch steps outside looking worn thin by travel, and never once asked to be thanked for it. And never once repeated the offer aloud on any visit after, she simply set a plate down whenever Etta came through. The way another woman might set out water for a thirsty dog without making a production of the kindness. Amos Cole, a quiet man who'd worked the flooded mines in his younger years and had stayed on at the fringes of that country ever since, agreed to walk out and look at the wash below the town site. And within a single day of covering the ground with a forked willow stick and a silence Etta found she didn't mind in the least, he told her exactly where to dig a new well. He was right on the first try, the same way her grandfather always had been, and he never offered a word of explanation for how he knew. Only nodded once when the water came in clean and cold at 18 feet. The axle Gideon came out to look at that first Tuesday turned out to need more than truing, a cracked hub he replaced himself. Working 2 hours in the yard without once complaining about the ride out or the low pay she offered him for it. When he finished, he ran a thumb along the new fitting and told her, in the same flat tone he used for everything, that whoever had built the original wagon hadn't known his trade half as well as he'd thought he did. And that was the closest thing to a compliment about her town that Gideon Pruitt offered in the first month of knowing her. Odalise, for her part, never asked a single question about where Etta had come from or what she meant to do with a dead town, though she must have wondered plenty. She simply kept a plate ready on the evenings Etta rode in for supplies, and once, without comment, folded 2 extra biscuits into a cloth and pressed them into Etta's saddlebag before she rode back out. The way a woman presses something into a bag when she doesn't trust the recipient to feed herself properly on her own. Amos said less than either of the other two combined, but what he said always held. He walked the whole town site with her once, end to end, naming which foundations still sat true and which had shifted enough to be worth abandoning. And when she asked him how he could tell so quickly, he only shrugged and said the ground showed a man its history if he bothered to look at it long enough. Which was near enough to something her grandfather might have said that she didn't trust herself to answer him right away. None of the 3 of them spoke of friendship, not once, in all the weeks that followed. Community formed instead the way Silas had always told her real trust got built in this country, a series of quiet, practical agreements, one at a time, each one tested before it was trusted. Gideon fixed what she couldn't manage herself and let her pay him fair, no more and no less. Odalise fed her and accepted, eventually, produce and split firewood in kind rather than coin, since coin between the 2 of them had come to feel like a small insult to something steadier than money. Amos came and went as the land moved him, said little on any visit, and was always right when he finally did speak. The rebuilding went on through the summer and into the fall, one task following the next in a rhythm that started to feel less like survival and more like a life she was choosing on purpose. She patched and sealed every window in the old land office and two of the sturdier houses beside it, repacked crumbling adobe with fresh mud mixed by hand, and replaced roof shakes one at a time with lumber Gideon hauled out on his own wagon at a price that was fair and no more than fair. She cleaned Cornelius Abbott's surveying instruments where she found them still stored in the old assay office, a transit gone dull with dust, a chain rusted at the links, a set of drafting pens in a case lined with cracked velvet, and oiled the brass back to a soft shine, and built a plain case along one wall to display them beside his claim map and his careful assay reports, so that anyone passing through would know a patient thorough man had once lived and worked in this place, and had left something worth remembering behind him. Winter came hard that first year and slowed the work without stopping it. She spent the short, cold days rechinking walls against the wind and the long nights mending harness and cataloging what little stock she'd managed to lay in. And by the time the ground softened again in spring she had 2 rooms sealed tight enough to hold a lamp's heat through a whole night. She dug the new well Amos had found deeper and lined it properly with stone, and fitted a windlass Gideon forged for her at cost, testing the rope and bucket a dozen times over before she trusted it with a full day's hauling. She cleared the old corral of collapsed rail and rebuilt it square, resetting each post plumb with a line and a bob the way Silas had taught her to set a survey stake. No post trusted until it had been checked twice. She turned the mercantile's bones into a proper trading counter stocked with goods hauled in from the rail crossing a little at a time as money and wagon space allowed, flour and coffee and horseshoe nails first, then lamp oil and canned goods, then finally the small comforts, hard candy and needles and bolts of plain cloth, that told a traveler a place meant to stay open past its first hard season. Over the door of the land office, once it was patched and painted and fitted out with shelves and a scale for weighing goods, she hung a new board, lettered plain and even, Solace Station. It became, within that first year, a way station for freight haulers and cattlemen crossing the basin, a place to water stock, buy supplies, and sleep a night under a roof that no longer let the weather in. She ran it herself, with Gideon's forge going most days in the yard behind it and Odalisa's cooking drawing travelers who'd have otherwise pushed on hungry and short-tempered into the dark. 2 years passed, and Solace Station earned its place on the maps freight drivers kept folded soft in their coat pockets, a known stop instead of a rumor to be avoided after dark. Etta earned a name of her own along with it. Folks up and down the crossing had taken to calling her Miss Solace, half in fondness and half because nobody could quite say any more whether the name belonged to the woman or the town. Small rituals had grown up around the place without anyone deciding on them outright. Odalise and Etta took coffee together most mornings before the first wagons rolled in, saying little, needing to say little, the silence between them as comfortable as an old chair. Gideon reshod any horse belonging to a family passing through short on cash, and never once mentioned it afterward to anyone, least of all to the family it had helped. A crust of bread got set aside most nights on the station's back step for whichever stray dog or footsore drifter needed it more than the woodstove did. Freight drivers who'd once skirted the whole basin to avoid the dead town started routing through it on purpose. Since a known stop with good water and a reliable smith saved them half a day over the old detour, and word of that kind traveled faster along a freight line than any newspaper could carry it. Children from the nearest ranches took to calling the place Miss Solace's town without any adult ever teaching them to. The way children settle on the truest name for a thing before the grown-ups around them get around to agreeing on one. Hollis Bragg rode through again that second autumn, a little older, a little grayer at the temple. His cattle still grazing the same boundaries he'd always run them across without much thought for who held the deed. He looked at the mended roofs and the busy yard and the freight wagons lined 2 deep at the trough, and he didn't say a great deal. He tipped his hat to her once, the unhurried way a man tips his hat to a piece of ground that turned out to know a good deal more than he had ever given it credit for, and rode on without another word about the $8 he'd once offered to be rid of it. On a quiet evening not long after, Etta stood alone in the front room of Solace Station once the last wagon of the day had rolled out and the lamps were the only light left burning on the street. She took her grandfather's compass down from the shelf where she kept it and set it on the mantel beside the small carved bird Cornelius Abbott had made for a daughter who never got the chance to hold it. She placed the two objects side by side, deliberately, the brass catching the lamplight next to the pale, worn wood. Two small things carried out of two very different griefs and set down together for the first time. Outside, a freight team she'd watered that afternoon had settled for the night in the yard, and through the window she could hear the low, unhurried sound of Gideon's voice trading some flat joke with one of the drivers by the trough, and Odalise moving pots in the back kitchen the way she moved them every evening, without hurry. As if the sound itself were part of what kept the place standing. She thought of Silas, who had given her a trade and a way of reading the world clear enough to survive whatever it handed her next. She thought of Cornelius, a stranger she would never meet, who had given her both the means to build something lasting and the reason to build it well and honestly. And she thought, without much heat left in the thought at all, of her Uncle Walton, counting $37 onto a desk in a gray office 2 years and a whole life away. And calling it a fair settlement. She felt no anger toward him anymore, only a distant kind of pity, because the man could never have imagined, in 100 careful ledgers kept over 100 careful years, what a sum that small would go on to build once it landed in the right hands. She turned the lamp down low, left both keepsakes sitting together on the mantel where the morning light would find them first. And went to bed the way she went to bed most nights now, tired in a good, earned way, and certain of exactly where she'd be standing come sunrise. Etta Marsh was 19 years old when she was cast out with $37 to her name and a deed nobody else wanted. It turned out to be the best $37 she ever received. If this one kept you up past your bedtime, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and tell me what you were once handed that everyone around you called worthless, and while you're at it, tell me what you carried out in your own pocket that turned out to matter more than anyone expected it to. Subscribe if you want the next one, because next time, it's a woman who inherits a wrecked ship nobody thought would ever float again, and what she finds locked in the captain's cabin changes everything.